The Pumpkin Blanket by Deborah Turney, Zagwyn. When Glee was born, the northern lights shook their folds above her bed, but no one saw them. Glee's family only had eyes for Glee. Later the door blew open and the wind tossed a blanket inside. Swoosh! No one heard. Glee's family only had eyes for Glee. Her mother called the blanket a gift, but could not remember who had given it. An aunt, Glee's mother guessed. A shy but friendly neighbor, ventured an aunt. Glee's father said nothing. He thought that the sunny-colored squares of the blanket looked surprisingly like his garden patch. Let's call it the pumpkin blanket, he suggested, because round baby Glee looked a lot like a pumpkin bundled up in it. The pumpkin blanket was a close friend of little Glee, light and warm around her baby's body, soft and dreamy between her fingers, smooth under her cheek. One cold winter's night, when the garden had a snowy blanket of her own, Glee was 3, peered out of her bedroom window. She could see the coyotes sniffing, pawing the frozen ground. Glee shivered as they raced back, whimpering and yowling through the birch tree skeletons into the dark forest behind. Only the treasured pumpkin blanket wrapped about her ears could stifle their voices. It was coyote-proof. One summer's afternoon, when the garden was abuzz with insect excitement, Glee, who was now 4, sorted through the compost pile rottings for baby worms. Later, one escaped from her shirt pocket at the dinner table. Glee was scolded and sent upstairs. There the pumpkin blanket was waiting and covered her like a tent. Peeking out from underneath, Glee saw the folds like distant mountains and wrinkles like waves on a patchwork lake. One day, late in September, Glee, who was now 5, was dancing with her blanket in the garden. Sometimes it was her cape, or it was her swirling skirt. Sometimes she held it high in the sky to flutter like the autumn leaves. Glee's father was busy in the garden rows, harvesting the vegetables. One by one, the brightly colored patches disappeared into buckets. Green leaves were piled to the compost heap. Soon all that remained were the pumpkins. Glee's father leaned on his shovel. Glee would go to kindergarten in the fall and to the local school after Christmas. She could not carry her pumpkin blanket to class. The older children would make fun of her when she stroked the satin edges with the soft and dreamy and smooth under her cheek. Glee, her father called, do you know that there are 12 pumpkins in our garden, just like there are 12 squares in your blanket? Glee clung to the garden fence, admiring the perky globes peeking out from under their wilting vines. Will they have faces, Papa, like Halloween comes? Will they grow teeth and grin? Yes, her father said. If they don't freeze this month, we can harvest them in October. We will have a family of faces on our porch this Halloween. Glee smiled. That night the first frost came. The next morning, Glee and her father saw that one pumpkin was not sheltered by the vines. It stood alone. Night after... Skip the page, excuse me. Glee, her father asked, will you share your blanket with the pumpkins? One square would cover the shivering pumpkin and save it from the frost. A lump came to Glee's throat, but she nodded. Then her father, reaching for his pocket knife, carefully cut the threads, separating a square from the pumpkin blanket. Gently, Glee covered the pumpkin. The next morning, Glee and her father hurried to the pumpkin patch. There was the pumpkin, plump as ever under its little square shawl. It had survived the frost, but another pumpkin had become exposed as the vines fell away. Glee knew that without a cover, the frost would bite it hard. She gave up another square from her pumpkin blanket. Night after night, the cold ripped through the garden. Night after night, Glee gave another square to another pumpkin to keep it warm. In the early October night sky, the northern lights began to flicker faintly again. Finally, Glee had only one square left. It was her favorite, the one with the thickest satin edge, soft and dreamy between her fingers and smooth under her neck. See all the pumpkins covered? That day, Glee did not go to the garden with her father. She sat on her bed and looked down at the pumpkin patch. So 11 pumpkins. There sat 11 pumpkins with 11 little blankets. The 12th pumpkin was alone. It was the biggest pumpkin of all, and the last one to be uncovered by the vines. When dinner time came, Glee was not hungry. She sat by her window and watched the wind blowing the dead leaves into circles around the pumpkins. The vines stiffened with the cold. Darkness was falling on the garden. Glee clutched her tiny pumpkin blanket tightly in her hand, and then her fingers loosened. She stroked the satin border of one last time. Glee padded down the steps and out the back door. She opened the garden gate and found her way to the pumpkin patch. The wind held its breath. The leaves lay still. Glee tucked her last scrap of pumpkin blanket around the biggest pumpkin of all and ran back to the house before she could change her mind. Glee missed her pumpkin blanket. She had a new down comforter, but it covered without comforting her. Only the sight of the blank-faced pumpkins in their woolen kerchiefs cheered her. Each of the blanket patches was the same color now, faded by the autumn sun and rain. Each clung to its orange pumpkin like a threadbare hat. On the evening before Halloween, Glee and her father took the wheelbarrow down to the garden for the last harvest. They separated the brittle vines from the yellow-orange pumpkins, and Glee imagined sewing her blanket back together. She took the first square from the pumpkin closest. It was no longer felt soft and dreamy between her fingers or smooth under her cheek. Suddenly, a gust of wind pulled the scrap right out from Glee's hand, carrying it above and beyond her reach. Glee and her father watched the wind flip the pumpkin squares off the rest of the pumpkins, blowing them high above the birch tree forest. The pumpkin squares tumbled upwards, floating higher and higher on a playful current of wind into a sparkling sky. That Halloween, 12 little faces lit Glee's porch. Their eyes and smiles shone brightly in the night. Look what Glee's got in her hand, though. The end. The Pumpkin Blanket by Deborah Zagwyn.